Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll examine two classic games of the former world champion José Raúl Capablanca. And the topic of this lesson is the outposts. Typically, the most common and ideal piece to occupy an outpost is a knight, although it could be some other pieces as well, as we shall see. Let's go to our first example, which is a game between Capablanca and one of the top grandmasters of the time, Yefim Bogolyubov, and this position has been reached after 40 moves at the London tournament in 1922. Well, what can we tell about this position? First of all, let's look at material. We see that as of pieces, it's even. White has two knights versus a bishop and knight, and of course a rook on each side. As of pawns, 6 each. So materially speaking, there is a complete balance. Now, let's evaluate the position on the strategical scale. The first thing we can notice that the black bishop on g8 is in a rather awkward position where it is right now. It's true that white has all of his pawns on light squares, the same color as black bishop. Nevertheless, because of the awkward positioning of the bishop, that bishop would be considered a bad bishop. Unless, of course, it can come all around and start targeting the white pawns from the back. That is, trying to get the bishop somehow to e8, and then after advancing the a4 pawn, getting it to a4, and then try to come and have an attack from the back of white's pawn chain. Well, that of course sounds all great and beautiful. Easier said than done. The white pawns, even though they are on light squares, in this case, they are greatly restricting the mobility of black's bishop. Okay, so that's one issue. Another issue is that black has a passed pawn on a4. Now that passed pawn can certainly become quite dangerous if it is able to advance further. Naturally, white will try to do everything it can to hold off that pawn, because the more advanced the pawn gets, the more power, the more dangerous it becomes. Now, let's talk about the knight on c5 for black. That knight indeed is beautifully positioned, holding off any kind of advancement of the white center pawns. It'd be a real good idea for white to try to get rid of that blockading knight on c5, perhaps by exchanging a pair of knights. To summarize everything, black is doing well with his knight on c5. Black has a potentially dangerous passed pawn on a4. The weak point of the black position is the bishop on g8 being totally out of play, and will probably need at least 5 or more moves to get the bishop activated. Okay, time to look at the position from white's perspective. As we said, white's goal should be to remove black's blockading knight from c5 in order to advance the c pawn and therewith create a passed pawn in the d pawn. A beautiful thing that white has is a potential outpost on e6. If you look, black no longer can control that square with any of his pawns, while white has two pawns, the d5 and the f5, both controlling that square, and because of that, giving a beautiful potential to white's knight on e6. Well, let's see how all these strategical elements work out in reality in practice. In this position, white immediately occupied that key square with knight e6. A very natural and strong move, although there are several things to evaluate right now. If black would capture the knight on e6, that certainly would be good news for white, because white, after recapturing, preferably with the f-pawn, would immediately obtain a protected passed pawn. And as we know, protected passed pawns, especially if one is as far advanced as this one is, can be extremely dangerous. So what happens then, after black moves out of the check, the black bishop is still totally cut out of play, and the white knight is able to position itself in an ideal square on d4, from where it will have the potential to chase black's king out of the way through the f5 check, or at times a check from c6. In addition, white will be ready to advance his c-pawn that's so crucial in creating a passed pawn. So this looks really unattractive from black's perspective, and of course would be a dream to come true from the white angle. In addition to the game move, in which case the black knight just moved away to b3, another option to evaluate was, what if black tries to win a pawn by capturing on e4 immediately? Well, that perhaps was a better choice than what black did in the game, but even after this pawn sacrifice, or black gaining a pawn, white will have certainly enough compensation and a bit more. Black captures the knight now, white king moves out of the check with a tempo attacking the rook, and now the black rook moves rook to h2, attacking the pawn on h3, and then the white king moves up to d4, opening up the third rank to protect that pawn. And now, for example, if black plays rook b2, the game plan is to play c5. And even when black succeeds in giving a check and chasing the white king down, white has a pretty realistic hope to win after the creation of the passed d-pawn. Nevertheless, this was a clearly better choice for black than what we shall see in the game. In this position, black proceeded with playing knight b3, keeping the knight on the board, and as an immediate threat, black now threatens to play a3, as the white rook from c3 at the moment does not hold off the a3 advance point. Well, there's nothing much white can do about preventing black playing from a3. However, what white can do is to advance his own pawn and try to promote the c-pawn himself. And indeed, that is the threat, simply to advance the pawn, whether by capturing on d6 and then to d7, or to advance it to c6 and then c7 and c8. In fact, if black right now would play a3, the best choice would be to capture on d6. If white now would push the pawn immediately to d7, then the black pawn would promote first and have the right to give checks. However, instead, white can and should checkmate in just 2 moves after check and rook e7. In these type of endgames, when both sides have passed pawns, the game largely becomes a race. Who gets there first? Let's go back again to our game. After c5, the game continued by black capturing on c5. And white recaptured, so now black's plan is put on a hold. The a-pawn cannot advance because the knight on b3 would be hanging. Therefore, black needs to do something about the knight, whether to exchange the knights immediately or do what he did in the game, move the knight to d2 with a check. Now, of course, white has no time to capture the pawn on a4, needs to get out of the check, which he moved to f2. It was important to notice that the king going to e3 wouldn't be a good idea because it would allow black to still advance the a pawn thanks to the trap that if rook would capture now on a3, then the fork would arrive with knight c4, winning white's rook on a3. Let's go back again and see how the game continued after black played knight d2 check. And white responded with king f2. And now the idea is to advance the d pawn with d6, d7, and d8. Black played king e7, trying to stop that. But let's examine the situation if black immediately would move the knight to b1, attacking white's rook, with the idea to then, indeed, let's say rook c4, push the pawn on a3. Well, now white can set a trap a bit similar to what we've seen. Knight e6, pawn advances to a2, rook c7 check, king e8, and now you can see the same pattern, white playing d6, threatening with the checkmate on e7. The problem is that now it's black's turn, and black can defend against it by eliminating the knight. Pawn captures back. Now white threatens with checkmate on c8, so black needs to defend. Rook to b8, and now white's problem is that they cannot stop the black pawn, therefore white needs to create constant threats to keep black busy and not giving the time to just promote that pawn. So the next best move is rook g7, threatening checkmate from the other side, king to f8. The rook is hanging, so it must move away to f7. If the king moves to the left, then the pawn advances to d7, and after king d8, rook f8 check, and the rook captures rook, and white wins easily. So the black king must go in the other direction to g8. And now the best move is rook b7, a beautiful move, trying to gain time so the e-pawn will be mobile to advance without losing the rook on f7. If now black does not capture on b7 but moves the rook away, then white will win even though black promotes the pawn first, because then the two pawns that both reached the 7th rank will be unstoppable. A beautiful combination for white. Of course, it's quite important the fact that black is unable to check white right now because the d4 square is covered by white's knight. Let's set the pieces back just a couple of moves to the position where we sacrificed our rook on b7 and see what happens if rook indeed captures on b7. Then white pushes the pawn further from the king because e7, the black king would just move next to the pawn and hold everything off. So the right move is d7. Now the rook is the only one that can stop it. And now e7. The difference is that now white has sacrificed the pawn. And even after promoting the new queen with d8, for example, rook takes and pawn takes, white has only balanced the material scale. So white does not have material advantage, although white still has the initiative and I think has a dangerous attack. For example, queen d7, and then as soon as the black king moves to a dark square, the white knight will move to f4, creating some additional threats. For example, after king f8, knight f4. However, this was certainly a better idea than what black had to face in the game. The game after king f2, as I mentioned, continued with king e7, holding off the white pawn. And again, the white king has to be careful where it goes, because if it goes to e3, again the same trick will work for black by black advancing the a pawn to a3. That is why white instead moved the king to e1 and not to e3. Now the black rook is a little bit stuck on b2 because it needs to hold on to the black knight on d2. And therefore the most logical move for black is to move the knight to b1. Of course, unlike in the previous variation, now the rook goes to d3, which is a very powerful square. On one hand, it kind of traps black's knight, and just as importantly, if not more, white prepares the advancement of the pawn. And here, black underestimated the power of white's passed pawn, and by all means should have rather given up on the a pawn and play king d6, even though that endgame looks quite sad for black as well. After a3, on the other hand, the game is definitely lost because the pawn is advancing, and now if the king moves to f7, then the pawn will get promoted, and after black gives the rook up for the queen and rook takes back and a2, the white knight just on time arrives to stop the promotion of the black a-pawn. Going back to this position, the black king in the game moved to d8, making sure the pawn doesn't easily get promoted. But here comes the problem. The white knight arrives quickly enough to chase the black king out of there. The threatening check on c6 followed by the d-pawn advancing is really devastating for black. Black had no other choice but to get the rook back, holding off that square, and now rook de6. Although advancing the d-pawn immediately did the job as well. Bishop captured, and now this is the important part. White captures back with the f-pawn. Now white is threatening to push the e-pawn first and then the d-pawn, and the pawn promotes. Black was trying to hold off the promotion squares, but it's a bit too slow. e7, king e8, and knight a6, threatening the rook, as well as check on c7, and black resigned. If black right now would advance the a-pawn, white would gladly capture the rook, allowing the a-pawn to promote first, because now white comes with check, and then even the promotion of the pawn will arrive with a check with an easily winning position. A very interesting endgame where we saw the beautiful outpost on e6 and then the power of passed pawns in the endgame. Let's see now another game that's going to be a bit different, although the key element also will be an outpost. Let's get to our next example where we'll see an entire game. Capablanca white and Reti with black from the same tournament just 4 rounds later. Black responded with knight f6, knight f3, g6. Black shows his intent to play the King's Indian, and white played a solid line but certainly well playable, and the big advantage is it has very little theory and you can simply play it by understanding. h3, bishop g7, and bishop f4. Now we can understand the idea of h3 to give the white bishop an option to hide on h2 after a potential attack by the knight on h5. Castle, knight d2, white continues developing, and so does black. Knight bd7 and c3. Now black has 2 typical plans, either to prepare an advance of the e-pawn or try to play with c5. I personally would prefer the e-pawn's advancement. Black, on the other hand, chose to play c5, and white proceeded with bishop c4, b6, castle, and bishop b7. White connected the rooks with queen e2, queen c7, and bishop h2, moving away from a potential e5 tempo attack by black. And black moved rook a to e8. And now white is ready to move forward and play e4. The idea is to advance the pawn even further to play e5, and then after the black knight moves away to e6. Black has to face difficulties already. The rook probably is a bit misplaced on e8 at the moment, and the queen is also has stepped into a pin by the white bishop on h2. Perhaps black's best option is to play e5 at this moment. Black chose first to trade pawns on d4, which opens the c-file, and I believe it favors white. You'll see how. Pawn took back, e5, and now immediately white gains time by occupying the c5 with the rook. This move, of course, immediately creates a discovery threat of bishop takes f7. Therefore, the black queen needs to move to b8. And white, very important choice, closes the center with d5. This puts the two black bishops out of play. It gains space for white and undermines the weak square on c6, and that is the key element I'd like to discuss in this game. Black played rook c8, immediately trying to counter white's occupants on the c-file, and bishop b5. Now we can already tell what white is looking to do. Put a piece, ideally a knight, but it's a little hard to get a knight there, so therefore white will settle with a bishop for now. Black was hoping to trade some pieces and gain a little more room for his remaining pieces. Rook c8, a typical advice. When you're in a cramped position, try to exchange some pieces so your remaining pieces have more room to maneuver. By the way, in similar situations, it's not unusual for white even to try to sacrifice an exchange by putting a rook on c6. However, in this case, it's clearly superior, not sacrificing anything and still accomplishing the same, having an outpost on that key square on c6. Black continued with bishop h6, trying to get rid of the bishop that's buried there behind the e5 pawn, and a very important move, b4, trying to cement that bishop there by potentially playing b5. If black would now respond with a6, white would follow up with a4. The game continued with bishop takes, and the knight captured back, and black captured on c6, with the idea that before white would ever get a chance to create a protected passed pawn by advancing the b4 pawn to b5, using the fact that the white c6 pawn is pinned, we'll play b5, disconnecting the white b pawn from the c pawn. Black, I guess, has hoped that that c6 pawn will become a target, a weakness, instead of a powerful pawn. However, white succeeded to get sufficient help to the c6 pawn, and it will never be in danger. Knight b3, the knight is coming to a5. Now that the rook on c1 is protected, the black knight is hanging. Knight moved to f8. And the next problem that black faces, in addition to the powerful c6 pawn, is the weakness of the d6 pawn. Game queen d3, knight e6, and another important element that, unlike the black bishop we saw in the previous game on g8 being out of play, the white bishop is also out of play now. However, white, by moving the king out of the way and then bishop g1 and playing f3, can and should and is bringing that bishop back to the game. Game queen b6, attacking the pawn. Now, of course, queen takes pawn on d6 would be suicidal, because black then would capture knight e4, attacking white's queen and threatening checkmate with queen f2. But white can take his time and simply protect the pawn, which he did, and now black is in difficulty. The game continued with queen d4, white traded queens, played f3, protecting the e4 pawn, and getting the bishop back to the game. Bishop g1, king f8, and now simply capture, followed by rook d1, and the d4 pawn is becoming history real quick. King e6, bringing the king to the middle of the board since we're in an endgame. And then after knight b7, white wins a second pawn, as the rook cannot take on c6 because of the fork, knight d8. Black loses a second pawn, and soon after, the game. A very well played game by Capablanca. No wonder he is considered as one of the geniuses of strategic and endgame play of all times. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, when there are so few pieces on the board, it's amazing the beauty and the tricks that are still ahead of us. As we know, if white would have two bishops against nothing, that would be an easy win. But here, black still has his rook and pawn. And black would be more than happy and willing to give up even both of those pieces if they could get just one of white's bishops. Because as we know, a bishop alone is not sufficient to win the game. Therefore, right now, bishop takes rook, king takes bishop with a draw immediately. I suggest you take a moment and try to analyze the position yourself and figure out the correct sequence to win the game. And the answer is the simple but powerful move bishop to g4. Now the black rook is hanging, and in addition white is threatening to checkmate. Therefore black only has one response that solves both of those tasks, moving the rook away to control the c3 square. And now bishop b6. White creates the same thing all over again, attacking the rook and threatening to checkmate with bishop a5. Okay, and black plays bishop c2 with the idea that after bishop a5, rook d2, and if bishop takes rook, king takes draw. So, is this a draw? No, this is one of those tricks. Pretty amazing. White just makes a waiting move with the king, making sure the black king is not in stalemate, and then when the king moves, the rook falls on d2 and game over. Black is in Zugzwang. A beautiful composition by Hildebrand. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time.